Please, your grace, I beg you, don't let them take the house. It's all I have left." The words echoed through the rain-soaked courtyard of Ashford Manor, spoken by a woman whose pride had been stripped away by circumstance, leaving only raw desperation. Lady Eleanor Hartwick stood trembling in the November deluge of 1852, her once fine dress, now nothing more than sodden rags, clinging to her shivering frame. The Duke of Thornfield, Alexander Blackwood, had come to claim what was legally his, a debt her wastrel brother had gambled away in a single night of reckless abandon. But as he looked down at this woman, something stirred within the cold chambers of his heart that had been sealed shut for 7 long years. The autumn of that year had been particularly cruel to the English countryside. The land surrounding Ashford Manor, once vibrant with life and prosperity, now lay barren and forgotten, much like the woman who stood before him. Alexander Blackwood was known throughout London society as the Ice Duke, a man whose heart had frozen on the day his young wife perished in childbirth, taking their son with her. He had built walls around himself so impenetrable that even the most determined debutantes and their scheming mothers had long since given up hope of thawing his heart. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, ruthless in business, merciless with debtors, and utterly indifferent to the suffering of those who crossed his path. Yet here he stood in the pouring rain, his expensive coat growing heavy with water, staring at a woman who should have meant nothing to him. Eleanor Hartwick had once been the toast of London, a celebrated beauty with a dowry substantial enough to attract even the most particular of suitors. But that was before her father's death revealed the extent of his secret gambling debts, before her brother Edward squandered what little remained, before her betrothed abandoned her at the altar when the money dried up. Now she was alone, cast out by a society that worshipped wealth and discarded those who lost it. "The house is mine by law," Alexander said, his voice as cold as the rain that fell between them. "Your brother signed the deed over to settle his debts. You have until week's end to remove yourself and your belongings." He turned to leave, his duty done, his conscience clear. But then she spoke again, and her words stopped him in his tracks. "I have nowhere to go, your grace. No family will take me in. I am a burden, you see, a reminder of scandal and shame. My mother's family disowned her when she married my father, and his family has made it abundantly clear that I am no longer welcome among them. The friends I once had turn away when they see me on the street, as though poverty were a contagious disease they might catch from mere proximity." Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "If you take this house, you take the last shelter I have in this world. I'm not asking for charity, your grace. I'm begging for mercy." Alexander had heard countless pleas from desperate debtors over the years. He had learned to steel himself against tears and supplications, to see only numbers and contracts, assets and liabilities. But something in Eleanor's voice, a quiet dignity beneath the desperation, a strength that persisted even as everything crumbled around her, penetrated his carefully constructed defenses. He turned back to face her, studying her properly for the first time. She was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair plastered to her pale face, and eyes the color of storm clouds that met his gaze without flinching, despite the tears that mingled with the rain on her cheeks. "What skills do you possess?" he asked abruptly, surprising even himself with the question. "Can you read, write, keep accounts?" Eleanor blinked at him in confusion, unsure where this line of questioning might lead. "I was educated by a French governess," she replied carefully. "I speak French and Italian fluently. I can manage household accounts and correspondence. I paint watercolors, though I'm not sure that qualifies as a skill of any practical value." An idea was forming in Alexander's mind, one so unexpected that he almost dismissed it out of hand. But the more he considered it, the more sense it made. His estate had been without a proper châtelaine since his wife's death. His sister, who had been managing the household, had recently married and moved to Scotland with her new husband. The temporary housekeeper he'd hired was adequate but unrefined, lacking the social graces necessary to manage the entertaining he was expected to do as a duke. And there was another matter, one that cut closer to his heart than he cared to admit: his young niece, Catherine, who had come to live with him after her parents' death in a carriage accident. The child was bright but lonely, in desperate need of gentle guidance and education. "I have a proposition for you, Lady Eleanor," he said, his tone businesslike despite the rain that continued to pour down upon them both. "I am in need of a companion for my niece and someone to manage my household affairs. If you accept the position, you may remain in this house. I will pay you a modest salary and provide for your basic needs. In return, you will serve my household with the same dedication and propriety you would have brought to your own, had circumstances been different." Eleanor stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign tongue she couldn't quite comprehend. "You would hire me? As a servant?" The words tasted like ash in her mouth, the final confirmation of how far she had fallen from her former position in society. Yet what choice did she have? The alternative was the streets or worse, the kind of desperate arrangements that had destroyed more than one fallen woman of her acquaintance. "I would employ you in a position suited to your education and background," Alexander corrected, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "You would not be a servant in the traditional sense. Think of yourself as a governess and household manager combined. You would have your own rooms, take meals with the family, and be treated with the respect due to someone of your birth, even if the circumstances have changed." He paused, then added with unexpected honesty, "I understand what it is to lose everything that matters, Lady Eleanor. Perhaps more than you might think." For a long moment they stood there in the rain, two souls battered by fate and circumstance, considering a bargain that would change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. Eleanor knew she should feel humiliated by the offer, degraded by the necessity of accepting employment from a man who should have been her social equal. But instead, she felt something else, a fragile, tentative hope that perhaps this was not the end of her story, but merely a difficult chapter in a longer tale yet to be written. "I accept, Your Grace," she said quietly, lifting her chin with a dignity that impressed him despite himself. "When would you like me to begin?" Alexander allowed himself the smallest of smiles, the first genuine expression of warmth his face had shown in longer than he could remember. "Tomorrow will be soon enough. For now, go inside and get warm before you catch your death. I'll send my solicitor round in the morning with the details of our arrangement." As he rode away from Ashford Manor, Alexander found himself thinking about the woman he had just left behind. There was something compelling about her, something that went beyond her obvious beauty, or the tragic circumstances of her fall from grace. She reminded him of a rose bush he had once seen growing wild in the ruins of an abandoned garden, battered by storms and strangled by weeds, yet somehow still producing the most exquisite blooms, their beauty all the more precious for having survived such harsh conditions. The following morning, Eleanor stood in the great hall of Thornfield Park, the Duke's ancestral estate, feeling as though she had stepped into another world. The house was magnificent beyond anything she had seen, even in her days of privilege and plenty. Marble columns soared toward painted ceilings where gods and goddesses cavorted among clouds. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like frozen waterfalls, casting rainbow prisms across walls hung with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge her presence with disapproving eyes. It was a monument to wealth and power, a stark reminder of the vast gulf that now separated her current station from the life she had once known. "Aunt Eleanor! Aunt Eleanor!" A small whirlwind in white muslin came flying down the grand staircase, nearly tripping over her own feet in her enthusiasm. Catherine Blackwood was 7 years old, with her uncle's dark hair and eyes that sparkled with mischief and intelligence. She skidded to a halt before Eleanor, bobbing an awkward curtsy that was more enthusiasm than elegance. Uncle Alexander said you're going to be my new governess and teach me everything. Can we start with French and painting? And may I call you Aunt Eleanor even though we're not really related? Uncle says I may, if you don't mind." Before Eleanor could answer, Alexander appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression stern as he addressed his niece. "Catherine, where is Miss Pritchard? You know you're not supposed to be running about the house unattended." The little girl's face fell. "Miss Pritchard had one of her headaches again, Uncle. She's lying down with a compress on her forehead. I was being very quiet. Truly I was. But then I heard voices, and I thought perhaps it was our new governess arriving, and I wanted to meet her properly." Alexander descended the stairs with measured steps, and Eleanor found herself studying him in the better light of day. He was perhaps 35, with aristocratic features that might have been handsome had they not been set in such severe lines. His eyes were the color of midnight, dark and fathomless, revealing nothing of the thoughts that moved behind them. He dressed impeccably in black, as though in permanent mourning for the wife he had lost. Everything about him spoke of control, of walls carefully constructed and vigilantly maintained. "Lady Eleanor," he said formally, inclining his head in greeting, "I trust you found the arrangements at Ashford Manor satisfactory for your final night there?" Eleanor curtsied, suddenly aware of how shabby her traveling dress must appear in these opulent surroundings. "Very satisfactory, Your Grace. Your housekeeper was most kind in helping me prepare for the journey here." "Excellent. Then allow me to introduce you to your primary charge. Catherine, this is Lady Eleanor Hartwick. She will be responsible for your education and general welfare. You will treat her with the respect and obedience due to someone in her position." Catherine curtsied again, this time with more care and precision. "I'm very pleased to meet you, Lady Eleanor. I promise to be a good student and not cause too much trouble." "Well, not very much trouble at least. Some trouble is unavoidable when one is 7, Uncle says so himself." Despite the uncertainty of her situation, Eleanor felt herself smiling at the child's earnest declaration. "I'm sure we shall deal with any trouble that arises together, Catherine. And yes, you may call me Aunt Eleanor if you wish. I would be honored." The little girl's face lit up like a candle, and she impulsively grabbed Eleanor's hand. "Come see the schoolroom. It's ever so lovely, with windows overlooking the gardens and shelves full of books, and Uncle just bought new watercolors all the way from France." Before we continue, I want to thank each of you from the bottom of my heart for being here with me on this journey. Knowing that my voice reaches you, bringing these stories that mean so much to me is truly special. Every view, every moment you spend here matters more than you know. Now, brace yourselves, because what happens next will change everything. The weeks that followed brought changes to Thornfield Park that none of its inhabitants could have anticipated. Eleanor threw herself into her new role with a determination born of necessity and pride. She would not simply survive in this position, she would excel at it, would prove that her worth went far deeper than the fortune she had lost. Catherine blossomed under her attention, revealing a sharp mind hungry for knowledge and a warm heart that had been starved for affection since her parents' untimely death. But it was Alexander who underwent the most profound transformation, though he fought against it every step of the way. He found himself inventing excuses to visit the schoolroom, ostensibly to check on his niece's progress, but in reality drawn by something he couldn't quite name. He would stand in the doorway, watching Eleanor teach Catherine French verb conjugations or guide her hand through a watercolor landscape, and feel something crack in the ice that had encased his heart for so long. One evening, as autumn gave way to winter and the first snow began to fall, Alexander found Eleanor alone in the library. She was sitting by the fire, a book open on her lap, but her eyes were fixed on the dancing flames rather than the printed page. "You seem troubled, Lady Eleanor," he said, settling into the chair across from her with an informality that would have shocked London society. "Is Catherine proving too much of a challenge?" Eleanor looked up. startled from her reverie. "No, Your Grace. Catherine is a delight. She's clever and kind, and I've grown quite fond of her in these few short weeks." She hesitated, then added with quiet honesty, "I was thinking about how strange life is, how quickly everything can change. A few months ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where I belonged. Now I'm discovering that perhaps I never knew at all." "And who are you discovering yourself to be?" Alexander asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. It was a question he rarely asked anyone, least of all himself. Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "Someone stronger than I thought. Someone who can survive losing everything and still find reasons to smile. Someone who values kindness more than status, substance more than appearance." She met his eyes directly, something few people dared to do. Someone quite different from the silly girl who once cared more about the cut of her gown than the content of her character. Alexander found himself captivated by her honesty, by the way she spoke of her own transformation without bitterness or self-pity. "You were never silly, Eleanor," he said, forgetting in that moment to use her title. "Perhaps simply young and sheltered, as many are in your former position. It takes courage to face hardship with grace, and from what I've observed, you have an abundance of both." Their conversations became a regular feature of the evenings. After Catherine was tucked into bed, Alexander would find his way to wherever Eleanor happened to be, the library, the music room, sometimes the conservatory where she liked to sketch the winter garden in the fading light. They talked about everything and nothing, about books and philosophy, about their losses and regrets, about dreams they'd once harbored and the realities that had replaced them. Alexander found himself sharing things he had never told another living soul. About the guilt he carried over his wife's death, the feeling that he should have somehow prevented it, the way his grief had hardened into something cold and unyielding that protected him from further pain, but also from joy. Eleanor listened without judgment, her gray eyes reflecting understanding rather than pity. "Grief is not something we conquer, Your Grace," she said one evening as snow fell softly beyond the windows. "It's something we learn to carry, like a stone we place in our pocket. Some days it feels unbearably heavy, and other days we almost forget it's there. But it changes shape over time, becomes smoother at the edges, less likely to cut us when we reach for it in moments of remembrance." "You speak from experience," Alexander observed. "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "I've mourned many losses. My father, my reputation, my place in society, the future I thought was mine by right. But I've learned that mourning what we've lost doesn't mean we can't embrace what we found. Both truths can exist together." It was during one of these evening conversations that Alexander first took her hand, a gesture so natural and yet so momentous that they both fell silent, staring at their intertwined fingers as though they held the secrets of the universe. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer suppress, "I fear I am in danger of doing something terribly foolish." She looked up at him, her heart hammering in her chest. "What might that be, Your Grace?" "Falling in love with you," he confessed, the words escaping before his considerable self-control could prevent them. "You've awakened something in me that I thought died 7 years ago. When I see you with Catherine, when I hear your laugh echoing through these halls that have been silent for so long, when you look at me with those storm-gray eyes, I feel alive again, Eleanor. And it terrifies me." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should pull away, should remind him of the vast distance between a duke and a paid companion, should protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak that would come from loving a man so far above her current station. But her heart had never been skilled at listening to such practical advice. "Then we are both fools, Your Grace," she whispered. "For I have fallen too, despite knowing how impossible such feelings are, how society would condemn us, both should they ever become known." Alexander raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles that sent shivers racing up her arm. "Society be damned," he said with a fierceness that surprised them both. "I've spent 7 years living by society's rules, doing my duty, maintaining my position, and I've been miserable every moment of it. Perhaps it's time I chose happiness over propriety, love over obligation." But the world beyond Thornfield Park's walls was not so easily dismissed. Rumors had already begun to spread through London society about the Duke of Thornfield and his mysterious new governess. Lady Beatrice Ashford, Alexander's late wife's sister, had made it her mission to discover everything she could about Eleanor Hartwick. What she uncovered displeased her greatly, not because Eleanor lacked breeding or education, but precisely because she possessed both. Beatrice had harbored hopes of becoming the next Duchess of Thornfield herself, had waited patiently through the years of Alexander's mourning, expecting that eventually he would turn to her for comfort and companionship. Now those hopes were being threatened by a woman whose only advantage was proximity, and Beatrice sourly admitted to herself, a beauty that had survived hardship rather than faded beneath it. She began to plot, calling upon old allies and leveraging old secrets, determined to drive Eleanor away before Alexander could do something irreversible like offering her marriage. The first blow came in the form of a letter, delivered to Eleanor's room late one night by a nervous housemaid who couldn't meet her eyes. The message was unsigned, but its contents were clear enough. Intimate details about Eleanor's broken engagement, about the debts her father had left behind, about whispers that she had perhaps encouraged her brother's gambling in order to secure more money for herself. All lies, of course, but skillfully crafted to wound and to sow doubt. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing fresh waves of shame and anger. She had thought herself beyond the reach of society's cruelty here at Thornfield, had dared to hope that her past might remain buried beneath the snow that blanketed the estate. Now she saw how naive that hope had been. The past never stayed buried. It always clawed its way back to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. She was still sitting with the letter in her lap when Alexander knocked on her door. "Eleanor, I saw the lamp burning beneath your door. Is everything all right?" He entered without waiting for permission, took one look at her face, and crossed the room in 3 long strides. "What's happened? Who's upset you?" Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. She watched his face darken as he read, saw his jaw clench with barely suppressed fury. "This is vicious slander," he said flatly. "Someone is trying to hurt you, to drive you away from Thornfield." He crumpled the letter in his fist. "I won't allow it. Whoever wrote this will answer to me." "It doesn't matter who wrote it," Eleanor said tiredly. "Don't you see? They're right about some of it. My father did leave debts. My engagement was broken. My brother did gamble away everything we had. The specific lies don't matter when they're built on a foundation of truth. This is who I am now, Alexander. This is what I bring to your house. Scandal and shame, and the kind of gossip that could damage your reputation beyond repair." Alexander knelt before her chair, taking both her hands in his. "You bring light to this house, Eleanor. You bring laughter and warmth, and a reason for me to wake each morning with something other than duty driving me forward. Whatever gossip follows, you pales in comparison to the gift of your presence here." He paused, then spoke the words that had been building in his heart for weeks. "Marry me, Eleanor, not as a governess elevated to duchess, but as my equal, my partner, my love. Let society whisper all it wants. We'll be too happy to hear them. I'm so curious, what country or state are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments below. It amazes me how these stories travel across the world and touch hearts in places I've never been. I can't wait to see where you all are joining me from. Now, prepare yourself, because the intensity is about to reach its peak." Eleanor wanted nothing more than to say yes, to throw caution and propriety to the wind and accept the love this extraordinary man was offering her. But even as her heart soared at his proposal, her mind calculated the cost. "I cannot," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. I cannot let you sacrifice everything you are, everything you've built for me. Your position, your influence, your standing in society, they would all be tarnished by association with someone like me. And Catherine, dear Catherine, deserves better than an aunt whose very presence brings scandal to her name. Catherine adores you, Alexander protested, and my position is secure enough to withstand a bit of gossip. Eleanor, please. But before he could finish his plea, the door burst open, and Catherine herself stood there, her small face pale with distress. Uncle Alexander, come quickly. There are men at the door, horrible men saying terrible things about Aunt Eleanor. They are demanding to speak with you. The scene that greeted them in the entrance hall was calculated to intimidate and humiliate. 3 men stood there in expensive coats and superior expressions, a lawyer, a banker, and a gentleman Alexander recognized as Lord Edmund Hartwick, Eleanor's uncle. The uncle who had turned his back on her when she needed family most, who had declared her dead to him when scandal touched her name. Your Grace, the lawyer began unctuously, we apologize for this late intrusion, but we've come on a matter of some urgency regarding the woman currently residing in your household under the name Eleanor Hartwick. Alexander's voice could have frozen fire when he replied, Lady Eleanor Hartwick is my employee and a member of this household. Whatever business you have with her can be conducted through me. Lord Edmund stepped forward, his jowled face flushed with righteous indignation. The woman you've taken into your home is not Lady Eleanor Hartwick. My niece Eleanor died 2 years ago of fever. This creature is an impostor, a confidence trickster who has somehow obtained knowledge of my family's private affairs and used it to insinuate herself into positions of trust. We have come to remove her before she can do you further harm. The accusation was so outrageous, so completely unexpected, that for a moment no one could speak. Then Eleanor found her voice, though it trembled with rage and disbelief. How dare you, Uncle Edmund? You know perfectly well who I am. You sat in my father's study and told me I was no longer welcome in any home bearing the Hartwick name. You called me a burden and a disgrace, and said I had brought shame upon the family through my very existence. I have never seen this woman before in my life, Lord Edmund declared flatly. She's clearly deranged, Your Grace, suffering from delusions of grandeur. I suspect she encountered the real Eleanor at some point before her death and learned enough about our family to construct this elaborate fiction. He turned to the banker. Mr. Pritchett, if you would be so kind as to explain the financial irregularities we've discovered. The banker cleared his throat importantly. We've uncovered evidence that someone has been attempting to access the Hartwick family trust using forged documents bearing Eleanor Hartwick's signature. The handwriting is quite skilled, I must admit, but our experts have determined conclusively that it doesn't match the real Eleanor's hand. We believe this impostor may be responsible. It was a masterfully constructed trap, Eleanor realized with growing horror. They were trying to paint her not merely as a fallen woman, but as a criminal. Someone who deserved not pity, but prosecution. And the evidence they were presenting, false though it was, would be difficult to disprove without resources she didn't possess. She looked at Alexander, saw the war playing out on his face between his faith in her and the documented allegations these men were presenting. I want everyone out of this house immediately, Alexander said with icy authority. Lady Eleanor will remain here under my protection while these allegations are investigated properly. If you have evidence of criminal wrongdoing, present it to the magistrate in the morning. But you will not come into my home in the dead of night making wild accusations without proof. We have proof, Your Grace, the lawyer said smoothly, producing a sheaf of papers from his case. Sworn statements from multiple witnesses who will testify that Eleanor Hartwick died in their presence. A death certificate signed by a physician, records showing that the real Eleanor had a distinctive birthmark on her left shoulder blade, which I doubt this impostor possesses. He paused dramatically, And most damning of all, we have the real Eleanor's diary, recovered from her effects after her death, which makes it quite clear that she never knew this woman and would be horrified to see someone parading about in her name. Eleanor felt the world tilting beneath her feet. They had thought of everything, had constructed lies upon lies until the truth was buried beneath them. She had no way to prove who she was, no documents, no family willing to vouch for her, no resources to fight back against such coordinated deception. "Why are you doing this?" she asked her uncle, her voice breaking. "What have I done to deserve such cruelty from my own blood?" For just a moment, something flickered in Lord Edmund's eyes, guilt, perhaps, or the shadow of shame, but it vanished quickly, replaced by hard determination. "You are not my blood," he said coldly. "My niece is dead. You are merely a clever fraud who has already caused enough damage. Come quietly, and I may be persuaded to show mercy. Resist, and I'll see you transported to Australia for fraud and theft." Catherine, who had been standing frozen in shock throughout this exchange, suddenly ran forward and threw her arms around Eleanor's waist. "She is too Lady Eleanor. I know she is. She's kind and clever, and she tells the truth always. You're the liars, all of you, bad, horrible liars." The child's fierce defense, so innocent and absolute, broke something in Alexander. He looked at Eleanor, really looked at her, and saw not a cunning fraudster, but a woman he had come to know intimately over months of shared conversations and growing trust. He saw the woman who had patiently taught his niece to paint flowers that actually resembled flowers, who had laughed at his terrible jokes and challenged his assumptions about the world, who had awakened his frozen heart simply by being exactly who she was. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, but with such steel beneath the words that all three visitors took an involuntary step backward. "You will leave my house now. Your allegations are noted and will be addressed in due time through proper legal channels. But Lady Eleanor Hartwick remains under my protection, and any attempt to remove her by force will be met with consequences you will not enjoy." He moved to stand beside Eleanor, his presence solid and reassuring. "I know who this woman is. Not from documents or birthmarks or the testimony of paid witnesses, but from months of observing her character in circumstances both easy and difficult. And I would stake my title and my fortune on her honesty." The lawyer tried one more time. "Your Grace, you're allowing your judgment to be clouded by—" "By what?" Alexander interrupted dangerously. "By facts, by evidence of my own observation, by the testimony of my niece, who is as honest a judge of character as any I've known?" He drew Eleanor closer, his arm protective around her shoulders. "The only fraud I see in this room is the one you three are attempting to perpetrate. Now get out before I have you thrown out." When they had gone, sputtering threats about magistrates and legal proceedings, Alexander turned to Eleanor with an expression of such tenderness that fresh tears sprang to her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I'm sorry that your own family would treat you so cruelly. I'm sorry that the world has been so unkind to you. And I'm sorry that I cannot simply make all of this go away with a wave of my hand." "Why?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you defending me? You barely know me, and now your reputation will be dragged through the mud alongside mine. They'll say you're harboring a criminal, that you've been taken in by a beautiful face and a sad story." She pulled away from him slightly, trying to maintain some distance despite the comfort his presence offered. "Perhaps you should let them take me. Perhaps that would be easier for everyone." Alexander's hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that tracked down her cheeks. "I'm defending you because I love you, Eleanor, because in all my years of navigating society's treacherous waters, I've learned that titles and fortunes and prestigious lineages tell you nothing about a person's true worth. I've known duchesses who were cruel and selfish, lords who were cowards and frauds. And I've known one governess who has more grace, more strength, more genuine nobility in her little finger than most of the aristocracy possesses in their entire gilded bodies." He kissed her then, a gentle press of lips that spoke of promises and possibilities, of a future they would fight for together. We will prove who you are, Eleanor. I have resources and connections they cannot match. And in the meantime, you will remain here, safe and protected, because this is where you belong. Not as an employee, but as family. As the woman I intend to make my wife. If you'll still have a foolish duke who was too blind to see your worth until you were standing in the rain, begging for mercy, you should never have needed to ask for. Catherine, still clinging to Eleanor's skirts, looked up at them both with shining eyes. Does this mean Aunt Eleanor is going to be my real aunt, and stay with us forever and ever? Eleanor laughed through her tears, scooping the little girl up into her arms. If your uncle and I have anything to say about it, yes, darling, forever and ever. But forever was proving more difficult to achieve than any of them had anticipated. Lord Edmund and his allies launched a campaign of character assassination that spread through London society like wildfire. Dinner parties buzzed with speculation about the Duke of Thornfield and his mysterious governess. Was she truly an impostor? Had she seduced him into believing her lies? What could drive a respected duke to defend a woman whose very identity was in question? The gossip columns printed increasingly salacious versions of the story, each iteration straying further from truth until Eleanor hardly recognized herself in the accounts. The legal proceedings were scheduled for the following month, a trial that would determine not just Eleanor's identity, but her fate. If she were found guilty of fraud and attempted theft, she would face years of imprisonment or transportation. The prospect terrified her, but what terrified her more was the damage this was doing to Alexander and Catherine. Already, invitations that once flooded Thornfield Park had dwindled to nothing. Old friends suddenly had previous engagements when Alexander called. Catherine had been disinvited from a birthday party she'd been looking forward to for weeks because the hostess deemed the association too scandalous. This has to stop, Eleanor told Alexander one gray morning as January snow fell thick and heavy beyond the windows. I can't let you sacrifice everything for me. Your position in society, Catherine's future prospects, your family's good name, they're all being destroyed because of me. Perhaps if I simply disappeared, went somewhere far away where no one knows the Hartwick name, this would all die down and you could resume your normal life. Alexander looked up from the legal documents he'd been reviewing, his eyes flashing with determination. Do you truly think I could resume any kind of normal life, knowing that you were out there somewhere, alone and unprotected, facing charges that could see you imprisoned or worse? Eleanor, I would burn my entire fortune and live as a pauper before I would abandon you to such a fate. But why? Eleanor cried, frustration and fear making her voice sharp. Why me? I'm nobody. Nothing, a woman so insignificant that even my own family can pretend I never existed. There are dozens of suitable women who would make you a proper duchess. Women with impeccable lineages and spotless reputations. Why risk everything for someone like me? Alexander set down his papers and came to where she stood by the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on top of her head. Because you make me feel alive, Eleanor. Because when I'm with you, I remember what it's like to laugh, to hope, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Because Catherine loves you and trusts you in a way she hasn't trusted anyone since her parents died. And because, quite simply, I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore. He turned her in his arms so she was facing him. You ask why you. I ask why not you. Your value doesn't come from your family's fortune or your position in society. It comes from your courage, your kindness, your strength of character. Those qualities don't disappear when circumstances change. They're what make you who you truly are. And who you truly are is the woman I love, the woman I choose, the woman I will fight for until my last breath, if necessary. His words wrapped around her like a warm cloak, pushing back the cold fingers of doubt and fear. But even as she leaned into his embrace, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting a losing battle. How could they prove her identity when everyone who might vouch for her had either died or turned against her? How could they combat accusations backed by forged documents and false witnesses? It seemed impossible, like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. The answer came from an unexpected source. 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, a letter arrived at Thornfield Park, addressed to Eleanor in handwriting she didn't recognize. The sender was a Mrs. Margaret Fletcher, and the name meant nothing to her at first. But as she read the letter's contents, memories began to surface, fragments of childhood that she had nearly forgotten in the chaos of recent years. "I hope you will forgive this intrusion, Lady Eleanor," the letter began. "My name is Margaret Fletcher, though you knew me as Maggie when I served as your nursemaid during your childhood years. I have followed your recent troubles with growing distress, and I can no longer remain silent when I possess information that might help establish your true identity. I have in my possession certain items that belonged to you as a child: a locket with your mother's portrait, a leather-bound journal where you practiced your handwriting, and several letters you wrote to me after I left your family's service. More importantly, I can testify to certain details about your childhood that only the real Eleanor Hartwick would know. If you would grant me the honor of calling upon you at Thornfield Park, I would be pleased to offer whatever assistance I can provide in this terrible situation." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, hardly daring to believe what it seemed to promise. Maggie had been her beloved nursemaid from the time she was born until Eleanor was 12 years old, when Maggie had married a shopkeeper and left service. They had corresponded for a few years after that, but eventually lost touch as Eleanor grew into young womanhood and Maggie became absorbed in raising her own family. Could this really be her Maggie, emerging from the past like a guardian angel exactly when she was needed most? "It could be a trap," Alexander warned when she showed him the letter. "Your uncle and his allies are desperate to win this case. They might have learned about your former nursemaid and convinced someone to impersonate her." But Eleanor shook her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The letter mentions the locket with my mother's portrait. That locket was lost when I was 8 years old. I dropped it in the garden pond while chasing butterflies and never found it again. My father was so angry. And Maggie comforted me and promised never to tell him that I'd been running when I should have been sitting quietly with my embroidery. No one else would know that detail." Mrs. Fletcher arrived the following afternoon, a plump, gray-haired woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands. The moment Eleanor saw her, she knew beyond any doubt that this was indeed her Maggie. They embraced like long-lost family, tears of joy and relief flowing freely. "My dear girl," Mrs. Fletcher said, holding Eleanor at arm's length to study her properly. "How you've grown and changed. But I would know you anywhere by your eyes, your mother's eyes, gray as storm clouds and twice as beautiful." She opened the worn carpet bag she'd brought with her and began laying out treasures on the table. The locket, indeed lost in the pond, but recovered years later when the pond was drained for cleaning. The journal with Eleanor's childish handwriting, showing her progression from clumsy letters to elegant script. A lock of baby-fine hair tied with a ribbon. Letters Eleanor had written in her teenage years, full of the silly concerns and grand dreams of youth. Each item was a piece of the past, proof of an identity that her uncle had tried so hard to erase. But it was Mrs. Fletcher's testimony that would prove most valuable. She knew details about Eleanor's childhood that could not have been fabricated or learned secondhand. The scar on Eleanor's knee from falling out of an apple tree. Her habit of humming off key whenever she concentrated on a task. The way she had insisted on naming every doll in her nursery after characters from Shakespeare plays. The birthmark the lawyer had mentioned wasn't on her left shoulder blade at all. That was a lie meant to trap an imposter who would either claim to have it or be proven false for lacking it. The real Eleanor had no birthmark at all, just a small mole behind her right ear that had been there since birth. "I know I should have come forward sooner," Mrs. Fletcher confessed to Alexander over tea that evening. When I first heard the rumors about Lady Eleanor being an impostor, I dismissed them as cruel gossip. But then I learned about the trial, about Lord Edmund's involvement, and I knew I had to act. That man never showed his niece a moment's kindness when she needed him. I'll not stand by and watch him destroy her now. With Mrs. Fletcher's testimony and evidence, the case against Eleanor began to crumble. Alexander's solicitors worked tirelessly to trace the source of the forged documents and false death certificate. They discovered that Lord Edmund had indeed paid a physician to create false records of Eleanor's death, the same physician who owed Edmund substantial gambling debts. The witnesses who claimed to have seen Eleanor die turned out to be servants in Edmund's employ who had never met the real Eleanor and could not identify her in person. The truth emerged gradually, like dawn breaking over a long night. Lord Edmund's motivation had never been about protecting the family honor or preventing fraud. It had been about money, specifically, about the substantial trust fund that had been established for Eleanor by her grandmother. If Eleanor were legally declared dead, that money would revert to the family estate, of which Edmund was the primary beneficiary. By painting Eleanor as an impostor, he could keep her from accessing the funds while simultaneously claiming them himself. The trial, when it finally took place, was a sensation that rocked London society. The courtroom was packed with spectators, eager to witness the drama unfold. Mrs. Fletcher testified with simple dignity about the child she had raised and the woman she recognized despite the years and hardships that had changed her. Handwriting experts confirmed that Eleanor's penmanship matched the juvenile samples in the journals. A different physician examined Eleanor and confirmed the presence of the mole behind her right ear, a detail that appeared in medical records from her childhood that Edmund's lawyers had overlooked in their rush to construct their case. Perhaps most damning of all was the testimony of the corrupt physician who had forged the death certificate. Faced with charges of fraud himself and the prospect of losing his medical license, he confessed to the entire scheme. Lord Edmund had approached him months earlier, even before Eleanor had taken the position at Thornfield Park, planning to use her supposed death to access the trust fund. When Edmund learned of Eleanor's relationship with the Duke, he accelerated his timeline, fearing that marriage to such a powerful man would put the money forever beyond his reach. The verdict came swiftly. Eleanor's identity was confirmed beyond doubt. Lord Edmund and his co-conspirators faced charges of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft. The trust fund established by her grandmother was released to Eleanor's control, making her suddenly wealthy in her own right. Most satisfying of all, perhaps, was watching the society that had so eagerly consumed gossip about her disgrace now falling over themselves to apologize and offer invitations and declare they had never doubted her for a moment. "Hypocrites!" Alexander muttered as another obsequious invitation arrived at Thornfield Park, this one for a ball being thrown in Eleanor's honor by a countess who had cut her dead in the street just weeks before. "Shall I have them all sent back with our regrets?" Eleanor considered the pile of invitations thoughtfully. Part of her wanted to reject them all, to throw their false friendship back in their faces and withdraw from society entirely. But another part of her, the part that was wiser and more forgiving, recognized an opportunity. "No," she said slowly. "I think we should accept some of them, not for their sake, but for ours. I don't want to hide away as though I have something to be ashamed of. I want to show them that kindness and grace can survive even the cruelest attacks. And I want Catherine to grow up seeing that true strength comes from rising above bitterness and choosing forgiveness." Alexander looked at her with such love and admiration that it took her breath away. "You are far better than they deserve, Eleanor Hartwick. Far better than I deserve, if I'm being honest." He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "But I'm selfish enough to be grateful for you anyway." Their wedding took place on a spring morning when the gardens of Thornfield Park were ablaze with daffodils and early roses. Catherine served as flower girl, scattering petals with such enthusiasm that several guests found themselves decorated with yellow blooms. Mrs. Fletcher wept happy tears in the front pew. Even the society matrons who had once condemned Eleanor now praised her grace and beauty, conveniently forgetting they had ever doubted her. But the people who mattered most to Eleanor were the ones who had stood by her in her darkest hours. Alexander, who had chosen her when she had nothing. Catherine, who had defended her with a child's absolute certainty. Mrs. Fletcher, who had emerged from the past to save her future. These were her true family, bound not by blood, but by love and loyalty. As Eleanor stood beside Alexander and spoke her vows, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything, her father, her fortune, her place in society, and in losing it all, she had found something far more precious. She had found her own strength, her own worth, her own capacity for survival and joy. She had learned that identity was not something bestowed by birth or wealth, but something forged through choices and actions, through how we treat others when we have power, and how we endure when we have none. "I love you," Alexander whispered as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "My Duchess, my equal, my heart." Eleanor smiled up at him, radiant with happiness. "And I love you, my dear, foolish Duke, who saw worth in a woman standing in the rain with nothing but her dignity to recommend her." The years that followed were filled with the kind of deep contentment that comes from a love tested and proven true. Eleanor used her restored fortune to establish a charity for women who had fallen on hard times, providing them with education, skills, and the support to rebuild their lives with dignity. Catherine grew into a remarkable young woman, kind and clever and strong, shaped by the example of an aunt who had overcome adversity with grace. Alexander became known not just as the Ice Duke who had finally thawed, but as a man who valued character over convention, substance over status. Together, he and Eleanor entertained regularly at Thornfield Park, opening their doors to a more diverse circle than London society was accustomed to seeing. Artists and writers alongside aristocrats, successful merchants alongside titled lords, anyone who demonstrated intelligence, kindness, and genuine worth regardless of their birth. Lord Edmund, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his greed and cruelty. Convicted of fraud and conspiracy, he lost his position in society and much of his wealth. His name became synonymous with disgrace, a cautionary tale about the dangers of placing money above morality, ambition above honor. Eleanor, demonstrating the magnanimity that had always been part of her character, ensured he was not left destitute but refused to allow him back into her life. Some betrayals, she had learned, did not require forgiveness to be released, only acceptance that they had happened and the wisdom to move forward without allowing them to poison the future. And so we reach the end of this journey together. I hope this story touched your heart as deeply as it touched mine in telling it. If you love this tale of redemption, transformation, and love that transcends social boundaries, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next story I have waiting for you. Leave a comment telling me which moment moved you most. I read every single one, and your words mean the world to me. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling these stories with me. Until our next adventure together, may you remember that true worth is never determined by circumstance or status, but by the content of one's character and the courage to remain kind when the world is cruel. May you find the strength to stand in the rain with dignity, and may someone worthy see your worth even when you have nothing left to offer but your authentic self.